Добрий вечір. Мене звати Тетяна Журженко. Я рада вітати вас в нашій школі викраденої Європи. Сьогодні у нас в гостях Katherine Янґер, Кейт Янґер. Її лекція буде англійською мовою, тобто я теж представлю її англійською мовою. Кейт Янґер is PhD candidate in Russian and East European history at Yale University, and she is also a research associate at the Institute for Human Sciences. Her dissertation is on the Greek Catholic Church in the 19th century and its geopolitical implications. Before starting her PhD program, Kate taught at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, and she has a bachelor in government from Harvard University. Most of all, and most important, Kate Янґер is also one of the co-organizers of the School of Abducted Europe, and today she is here in her capacity as a scholar, as a historian, and she will tell us about the idea of Slavic Europe.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Yes, so when I was thinking about when we were putting together the calendar for the School of Abducted Europe, I was thinking, what in my capacity as a historian of the 19th century can I possibly say about this? And what I think, and what I ended up deciding to talk about is something that I think is a term that is thrown about a bit today, but perhaps it's worthwhile going back and looking at what this term actually meant when it first became popular. So that term specifically is that term specifically is Okay, so specifically I'm talking about Pan-Slavism here. So initially I had formulated the question, of course, as my dissertation discusses the Greek Catholic Church. Initially I came to the question of Pan-Slavism through the lens of Galician Ruthenians. And they're how I know about what was going on in Pan-Slavism, but actually I think I'm going to sort of put them off to the side today as I talk more generally about these issues. There are essentially three varieties of Pan-Slavism that I want to talk about today. And I'm going to start with two that may be at least somewhat familiar if you've ever heard of the concept, heard how it was used historically, and then one that is particularly intriguing to me because we don't really think about it anymore, and it might be surprising. So the two that people may have heard of are Austroslavism and what I'm calling Russocentric Pan-Slavism, so a variety of Pan-Slavism that puts Russia at the center. And then the third one that is particularly intriguing to me is this notion of Catholic Pan-Slavism. So what I'm going to try to do is give an overview of what exactly these different varieties were, because, like I said, the term Pan-Slavism is used, but not always considered particularly carefully. We generally, our minds go specifically to this form of Pan-Slavism that's focused on Russia, as it's the only one that gained real traction and had real staying power over a longer period of time. But I still think it's important to stop and think about the others and what they particularly meant in the 19th century. So to begin with, what exactly is Pan-Slavism? This is a harder question than it seems because it's simultaneously a cultural and a political phenomenon, right? So on the one hand, there's this cultural element of we have these Slavic affinities with each other, our languages are from the same family, we have these common historical experiences, so there's something that binds us all together as Slavs. On the other hand, there's also a strong political element to it. So the notion of Pan-Slavism Pan-Slavism really gained traction in the 19th century when nations were first awakening, coming to a sense of themselves, and they were trying to figure out where they would fit in the European order. And so these cultural and political elements took on different weights at different moments. What I'm talking about today is not so much a sort of state-sponsored, top-down propaganda machine, and which is sort of how we may mainly think of Pan-Slavism, right? So the Russian state, the Russian imperial government, portrays itself as the savior of Slavdom, something like that. That's not so much what I'm going to talk about today, though of course it is a part of it. Instead, what I'm interested in more are the sort of thinkers behind Pan-Slavism, the intellectual currents that shaped what the term came to mean. This isn't the sort of Pan-Slavism that's cited as a classic cause of the First World War, anything like that. Instead, this is individuals and groups of people figuring out how to organize society and how to build states in a way that makes sense. I also want to say that all of these thinkers thought of the Slavic world in fairly, what we would see as sort of blunt or not precise ways. It wasn't the same sort of complex, nuanced identity discourse that we have today so much. Instead, it was really like, you speak a Slavic language, clearly you are a Slav, clearly therefore you are part of this Slavic project, right? So it's much, they're dealing in broad strokes rather than with a lot of nuance. So all three of the forms that I'm going to talk about today began to take form around the 1840s. So though it doesn't really make sense to put a precise moment on them, but this is when the sense of Slavic community began to take on political forms that went beyond a shared sense of cultural characteristics. And the cultural sort of affinities really, I think you can most accurately date to the early 19th century, maybe even a little bit before, but Herder and the idea of Romanticism was what really sort of motivated this and brought this to the forefront. So all of them really took off in the 1840s, but then they sort of petered out over different lengths of time. So they had different amounts of staying power, the different varieties. So to begin with Austroslavism. So what is Austroslavism? Well, the general principle behind it was that the Habsburg monarchy, what later became the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was the single best way to unite the Slavic world. That there was something unique about the Habsburg dynasty, about the Austrian state, that would provide the best protections for the Slavic nations. And this was rooted above all in the idea of liberalism, right? Austro-Slavist thinkers saw the best guarantee for Slavic nationalities to be preserved in a strong liberal state that had, they were even talking about constitutional protections of national rights, and that if they were if all of the Slavic nations were brought together under the Austrian crown, this would be possible. Their uniqueness would be preserved in certain ways, and yet at the same time, they would all have a way to sort of pool their sovereignty. Closely related to this is the question of what idea of Europe did Austroslavism entail? Well, I think it meant specifically a liberal idea of what Europe could be. Now, this may seem anachronistic to talk about a liberal Austria in the 1840s, right? When you think of the Austrian state at that time, it seems more accurate to describe it as maybe an enlightened monarchy. Later, after 1848, it really becomes neo-absolutist. But these Slavic thinkers saw the potential within the Austrian state to take on these liberal characteristics. Now, why exactly that is, it's kind of an interesting question. Is it because they saw something inherent in the nature of the Habsburg dynasty, for example? Did they see the rulers as somehow having this predilection for liberalism in them? Or was it just that they saw a state that was fairly weak and decentralized and thus maybe would be more accommodating? It's hard to say for sure, but no matter what, Austro-Slavic thinkers envisioned a Europe in which the Habsburg Empire was the dominant political force. It was liberal. It gave rights, equal rights to all the nations within it, and above all to the Slavs within it. So when did this Austro-Slavic movement have its key moment? Well, of course, that would be 1848, right? Everything comes to a head in 1848. As I'm sure you all know, there's a series of revolutions, of national revolutions across Europe, including across the Habsburg lands during 1848. And in a reaction to this, although these revolutions are themselves suppressed fairly quickly, in reaction to this, there is a sense that maybe we rulers of European countries need to give some additional rights and privileges to our citizens. So one of the key moments here is that in 1848, a parliament is convened in Frankfurt to discuss the future of Germany and what is Germany going to mean. Is Austria and the Habsburg monarchy going to fall into this new Germany? Is it not? So one of the people that they invite to the Frankfurt parliament is a Czech thinker, František Palacký, and he is invited to take part in this in this parliament to decide the fate of Germany, right? And he declines. And he writes that, you know that in the southeast of Europe, along the frontiers of the Russian Empire, there are many Slavic nations differing in origin, language, and history and morals, none of whom is sufficiently powerful itself to bid successful defiance to the superior neighbor on the east for all time. They can only do so if a close and firm tie bound them all together as one. The vital artery of this necessary union of nations is the Danube. So the Danube being, of course, what runs straight through the Austrian territories. The focus of power in such a union must never be diverted far from this river if the union is to be effective and to remain so. If the Austrian state had not existed, it would have been a behest for us in the interests of Europe and indeed of humanity to endeavor to create it as soon as possible. So what Palacký argues here is that without Austria as a protection for the Slavs along the Danube, so the vast majority of them, right, there would be no hope of them preserving their national uniqueness within this community, right? So Russia is over there lurking. If Austria isn't here to protect the uniqueness of, say, the Czechs and the Slovaks, the Poles, the Ruthenians, then they're all going to get swallowed up by this giant Russian force. So Palacký says, no, I'm not going to go to Frankfurt and be part of your new Germany. Instead, I want to keep this state that's focused on the Danube, of which Austria is the head, but the Slavs are the key components. Now, this is not something, while this version of Pan-Slavism has its moment, it's not something that's sustainable in the long run. Because what it's dependent on is believing that Austria actually can be the organizing force, right? It depends on believing that Austria is strong enough to actually provide this overarching banner that can counteract the force from the east, whether that's Russia, whether that's the Ottoman Empire. And very soon after 1848, that's already called significantly into question. So I think you can point to two moments in particular that render this kind of a nonsensical vision and that lead Austro-Slavism to more or less die out. And the first of these is the neo-absolutist turn in Austrian politics in the 1850s. So instead of the sort of more liberal hopes that everyone had pinned on the state prior to the revolutions of 1848, in the moment after 1848, the Austrian state really consolidates, strengthens itself, builds up its police forces, introduces new censorship measures, etc. So any idea of a Slavic Europe that's rooted in liberalism has no place in Austria anymore at this moment. And so the Czech leaders of this movement sort of despair of Austria ever being a meaningful organizing point anymore, and they put it aside and move on. The other thing that I think puts a real final end to Austro-Slavism is the so-called Ausgleich. So when the Austro-Hungarian Empire is formed by splitting the lands into Austria and Hungary, In this moment, both the Czechs and the Poles, who were the biggest Slavic stakeholders in the Austrian monarchy, feel that they've been betrayed because they don't get this same good deal that they think the Hungarians get, right? They think the Hungarians won, we lost. Austria clearly does not have our interests at heart. How on earth can there be something called Austroslavism? That makes no sense. And so I think by 1867, when the Ausgleich happens, Austroslavism is a sort of bygone romantic notion that no one really believes in anymore. But that isn't the case for the next form of Pan-Slavism that I'd like to talk about, and this is the one that has received the most attention, and deservedly so, because it did find the greatest traction, and this is Russocentric Pan-Slavism. So normally, this is, when people just use the words Pan-Slavism, this is what they have in mind. But I'm specifically referring to it as Russocentric because I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that there were other potential organizing principles for the Slavic world. So the general principles are fairly obvious. Russia should be the center and the defender and the protector of Slavdom, right? So it has been given this sort of moral mission on the basis of its historical role, its cultural role, its role as the center of orthodoxy. For any number of reasons, Russocentric Pan-Slavic thinkers believe that Russia is what is going to save the Slavic world. Now, this is different from simply Russophilism, which is another term that gets used a lot, because Russophilic thinkers believed that they should just become part of the great Russian nation, that the future of all Slavs lie in simply becoming Russians. And this is not what Russocentric Pan-Slavic thinkers thought. Instead, they believed that there were distinctions within the Slavic world between different nations, and yet they all needed to be under the umbrella of Russia. So to some degree, this is perhaps a slightly more, at least on the Russian side, a slightly more cynical version of Pan-Slavism, I would say, because there is a certain degree to which Russian thinkers and government actors simply used this rhetoric to accomplish their geopolitical goals, right? There was an element of that, definitely. There was a sense that if we say we're protecting the Slavs, then we can go do whatever we want in the Balkans, right? We can lay claim to Bulgaria, things like that. We have this moral authority and right to go in and affect things. Okay, so there is this cynical geopolitical part, but also I do want to highlight the fact that for a large number of people, this was a true belief that this was the right way, the moral way that things should be. And this wasn't only Russians who thought this way, but it was also people across the Slavic world. And that's something that now kind of seems hard to believe, given how clear it is that the Russian state instrumentalized this rhetoric in some ways. So Russocentric Pan-Slavism has its origins in approximately the same moment as Austroslavism, the 1840s, somewhere around there. But it becomes an even more relevant concept after the Russian defeat in Crimea. The historian and cultural studies scholar Olga Mayarova has argued convincingly that the idea of a supranational empire loses a great deal of its appeal after a defeat in war. This prompts a return, so from 1853 onwards, a return to ethnic or national thought rather than the sort of statehood logic that had motivated a lot of Russian thinkers before, and promoting the idea of Russians as the anchors of Slavdom. So what role does Europe play in the Russocentric Pan-Slavic ideal? Well, in short, it serves as a sort of foil. The belief arises among Russocentric Pan-Slavic thinkers, and before them among the Slavophiles that we're aware of from even earlier, that Europe is the source of everything that is going to eat away at all that is good in society, right? So the influential Slavophile Stepan Sheveryov, for example, frequently writes about rotting Europe. So a Europe with all of its individualism is dissolving the social bonds that hold us together. Russocentric pan-Slavic thinkers often hearken back to the ideas of mir and obshina and how important these collective social units are for Slavic life, right? And if we let Europe take over, we're going to lose these, we're going to become isolated from each other, and everything is going to fall apart. So, what do you do if you have this idea? Well, one of the main things that Russocentric pan-Slavic activists decided to do was actually to go to Europe and spread this message from the inside. So one of my favorite and sort of most vivid examples of this is the priest Mikhail Raevsky, who from 1842 onwards was the nastoyatel of the Russian Orthodox Church at the Russian embassy in Vienna. So he shows up in Vienna. He grew up near Nizhny Novgorod, decided to go into the foreign service in a way, and get sent to Vienna. While he's there, fascinatingly, he's simultaneously employed by the Russian Orthodox Church in his role as a priest, but because he's attached to the embassy there, he's also an employee of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Empire. So this gives him this sort of unique role and position to spread the ideas that are coming from the Russian government outwards. So what are his schemes? Well, so the first thing that he does is he tries to draw all of the university students who've come to Vienna into his circles. So Vienna, at the heart of Europe, right, at the heart of this rotting Europe, is precisely where all of the seminarians, all of the particularly gifted students come for their education. They come from all across the Habsburg lands, so from Galicia, they come from the Czech lands, but they also even come from the Ottoman Empire, so they're coming from throughout the Balkans as well. And they're all settling in Vienna, where they suddenly sort of feel themselves slightly adrift. So I don't know if you know Ernest Gellner's thesis that what causes the growth of national sentiment and nationalism is when someone from the periphery goes to the metropole and finds that in the metropole, they don't speak your language, you're cut off from society, you feel increasingly alienated, and what do? You look for people who are like you. So when you're a university student, that's a perfect example of this. You go, you don't know anyone, who do you look for? You look for the people who speak the same language, have the same ideas as you. And so Raevsky is able to use this to his advantage. And so he starts organizing these evenings at his apartment, at a sort of salon in a way. And what he does is he subscribes to all of the major Russian periodicals, any books he can get his hands on from the Russian Empire, and he just sort of lays them out and invites all of these people to his flat and just sort of lets them draw their own conclusions. And to his delight, they mostly draw the conclusion he wants them to, which is that Russia is a far better advocate for Slavic interests than the Austrian Empire, than Europe, right? So then, what's the next step? Well, then, if you've kind of got them, you start having them spread the message themselves. So then he starts sending them back to Galicia, these priests who he's been training. He sends them back with periodicals, all of this sort of thing, to spread the message in Galicia. So this is like from beating Europe at its own game, almost, because it's Europe that has sent these people to the center to study all of this learning. This is a very European thing, but let's use that to our advantage. And so he sends them back, and they take back this message that Russia has their interests at heart, and they preach it in the church, in their churches once they've become priests, and the message spreads like that. And so in general, so Rayevsky is a very vivid example of this, but it happens in a significant number of venues. For example, in 1867, there's a ethnographic exhibition in Moscow to which a large number of Slavic activists are invited. They're kind of shown how much more authentic this all-Slavic ethnographic exhibition is than the world fairs that are happening in Paris, for example. So this happens exactly at the same time as an exhibition in Paris. The exhibition in Paris is all about industrial development, how the world is moving forward, how progress is going to save us all. And then you go to the exhibition in Moscow, and it's a bunch of people dressed up in ethnic costumes, and they're saying, actually, this is how we're going to move forward and save the world, right? So it's this really strong juxtaposition of cultures. And it's really, I think it really means something and is really important that to a large number of Slavic thinkers, non-Russian Slavic thinkers, this Russian version had more appeal than the European version. And what does that say about the European version? It's hard to say for sure. So Russocentric Pan-Slavism does not die out the way Austroslavism does. It continues on. It maybe has a slight sort of dip in the late 19th century, but by the early 20th century, it's back in full force and keeps going strong well beyond that. And, every time it rears its head, it's important to think back to how it first began. So the last one that I want to talk about is kind of my pet variety of Pan-Slavism, but I won't talk about it too long because it really, while it's very interesting, it didn't ever find the same traction that Russocentric Pan-Slavism did. So this is Catholic Pan-Slavism. So this is the kind of bizarre notion that rather than orthodoxy serving as an organizing principle for the Slavic world, in fact, it should be the Catholic Church, right? This is numerically, this is kind of a crazy idea because the percentage of Slavs who are Catholic is much, much, much smaller than the percentage who are Orthodox. Nevertheless, there's this moment in the mid-19th century when both sides think, both the Slavs and the Catholic Church think, this is how we're going to save ourselves and we're going to save Europe. So the message that the Catholic Church puts out through a key number of individuals within certain departments within the Vatican, so De Propaganda Fide, the missionary organization, etc. So their message is both Europe and the Slavic world are in danger. But if we can bring Slavdom together in the Catholic faith, we will be able to strengthen Slavdom because Catholicism is always good for everyone. And then it will also be able to, then these Slavs will be able to go on and strengthen Europe in their faith. So why does this catch on at this particular moment? Well, the 19th century is a real moment of panic within the Catholic Church. I think that's fair to say. They have this strong sense that the secular world and secular Europe is winning the struggle against them. You may have heard of, in 1864, there was this thing published called the Syllabus of Errors. And so what it was it was issued by the Pope, and it listed all of the things that the world was saying that were false and needed to be condemned. The final one that they list, that the Pope lists here, this is an error. It is an error to believe that the Roman pontiff can and ought to reconcile himself and come to terms with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. So, if that's an error, that means that progress, liberalism, and modern civilization are in direct opposition to the Vatican's values, right? So you see again, actually, there's an interesting parallel between the Russocentric Pan-Slavic message of Europe rotting, and actually the Catholic Pan-Slavic message of Europe rotting. So for some, people really did not have a lot of faith in Europe's future at that time, which is interesting and kind of echoes some of what we're hearing now. So Western Europe in particular is considered to be a lost cause, right? France hasn't been reliable for nearly a century since the French Revolution. Germany's probably suspect as well. But the Vatican thinks the Slavs are still devout. especially the Slavs of the Eastern Rite, Eastern Rite Catholicism. So at that time, there were essentially 3 million Greek Catholics living in Galicia, and the Vatican thinks these are the people who are going to save us all. One of the people who is the promoter of this message is a man called Ipolit Terlecki. He was born a Pole, had a sort of conversion moment, a conversion awakening moment, decided that he was going to consider himself a Ruthenian, converted to Greek Catholicism, and decides that he is going to be the one to spread this message. So his message is there's a force sweeping across all of Europe, and that force is Pan-Slavism. And if Pan-Slavism is going to win out in any form, heaven help us, it better be Catholic Pan-Slavism instead of any other kind of Pan-Slavism. So he devotes himself to saying, why don't we send missionaries throughout the Slavic world? Surely if we try hard enough and are smart enough about it, we can convince all of these Orthodox people that they're wrong and bring them back into the Catholic Church. This doesn't happen, but it was... He really, legitimately thought it could happen, which is kind of amazing when you think back on it now. So this vision was powerful for a very specific segment of Slavdom, right? Catholic Slavdom. But not even all of Catholic Slavdom, because the Poles were very suspicious of this because it was about Eastern Rite Catholicism. So it looked like Orthodoxy, all the rituals were the same as Orthodoxy, so the Poles think to themselves, this can't be real Catholicism. So even the Poles are opposed. And of course, the Orthodox Slavic population largely felt threatened and excluded by this. I mean, somebody's saying, if you want to truly be Slavic, you have to become Catholic. That doesn't sound like a very welcoming message. And then the other group that had a real problem with this was the slowly but growing secular intelligentsia among the Slavs. So Ivan Franko wrote that the words Catholic Pan-Slavism are just a stringing together of empty symbols without meaning or sense. It's some sort of fancy turn of phrase like white coal or baked ice. So this just seems completely absurd to him, and he rejects it. And in reality, the Catholic Church, despite its thinking that this would be the way to save themselves, the Catholic Church wasn't strong enough to implement these dreams, and so it fell by the wayside by the 1880s or so. To kind of come back and look once more at how these different concepts of Europe played out, I want to take one particular case, a point of comparison through which the different views of these different varieties of Pan-Slavism become very clear. And this is how all of them used St. Cyril and Methodius. I think that this is a particularly illustrative case of how each of them thought of Europe and the Slavic role within Europe. So to begin with, we can just sort of cross Austro-Slavism off the list. They had no real particular interest in religious questions. Religion to them was far less important than a liberal state that could protect everyone's rights to practice whatever religion they wanted. So to them, Cyril and Methodius are not really something that makes sense to use as a symbol to sort of bring into service, to press into service. However, the other two varieties, both Russocentric Pan-Slavism and Catholic Pan-Slavism, both co-opt them very heavily. Russocentric Pan-Slavism kind of gets the jump on it, so they get to it first. And in 1862, which is the 1,000th year anniversary of their converting the Bohemian king, the Russocentric Pan-Slavists back in Moscow and elsewhere decide that they're going to turn this into a big celebration of Cyril and Methodius. So Mikhail Pogodin, the sort of leading Pan-Slavic thinker, writes a letter to contrast the origin myths of the Slavs with those of Western European nations. So he says that Western European nations mark their point of founding by the sword, right? So when did somebody conquer somebody else? We Eastern Europeans, we Slavs, must begin our history precisely with the apostolic activity of these brothers who brought us our alphabet and who brought us the word of God in our own language, right? So, okay, you have this godless Western Europe over here that is all about war, it's all about conflict. Meanwhile, we're back here, we have these two brothers who alone, their story alone, can bring us all together. They were the ones who brought us language, they also brought us religion, and thus there's a fundamental connection between language and religion, in our case, that means that Orthodoxy and the Slavic languages need to be a fundamental part of our identity. Meanwhile, the Catholics are not content to let the Russians lay claim to Cyril and Methodius. They say, hold on a minute, this was before the schism, before the Great Schism ever even happened. How can you say that they were Orthodox? In fact, they were Catholic. So they say all the good things that Cyril and Methodius brought you, they do not belong to Russia, they do not belong to the Orthodox Church, in fact, they belong to us. And so in 1880, Pope Leo XIII decides to have a sort of global feast day for Cyril and Methodius. So they have a feast day already within the Catholic Church, but it's kind of only celebrated in certain countries. Slovenia is the one that particularly celebrates it within the Catholic world. But Leo says, okay, we're going to make a big deal out of this on a global scale. So he invites several hundred priests, bishops, archbishops from across the Catholic world, of course, mainly Slavs, but not only, and he issues an encyclical in which he says, we thank God for giving us this suitable occasion to thank the Slavic people and to effect a common benefit for them. May they be strengthened in the profession of the true faith, in true obedience to the Church of Jesus Christ. May they understand more each day how great a force of good comes from the customs of the Catholic Church. There is nothing we desire more than to take the appropriate measures for their comfort and prosperity and to have all their relations with us be in perpetual harmony. So he, contrasting what Pogoydin says, he says actually all the good things that they did belong to us, not to them. They and we are the source of all peace and all harmony within the Slavic world. Come be part of us. This has no effect. Within a few years, they've given up. They've moved on to other questions. One thing about the Vatican in the 19th century is they never focused on any one issue too long. They kind of had a really hard time with their attention span. So it really only took a couple years before they had moved on from this celebration of Cyril and Methodius. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude here. And what I want to point out, one thing that I think is interesting if we're thinking about the discussions that we're continuing to have today is there's this notion of pooled sovereignty involved in Pan-Slavism, right? You can't make it on your own. If you are a small Slavic nation, particularly, say, the Ruthenians, who think of themselves as consisting of nothing but peasants and priests, you can't survive on your own. You have to find somebody with whom to share sovereignty in a way. And for that, even Slavdom as a whole wasn't sufficient in their eyes, right? Just saying all we Slavs are going to stay together and we're going to be fine. No, they had to find some greater organizing principle. Now, that may have been Austria, that may have been Russia, that may have been the Catholic Church, but all of them looked beyond themselves. And I think that that's very interesting, what this idea that sovereign nation states are something that is going to struggle on its own. The other things that I had thought of when I was thinking about what this can mean for us today, I think the most obvious one is this idea that comes through so strongly in Russocentric Pan-Slavism as Slavism as the idea of Slavdom as a rejection of Europe and European values. And this is something that I want to highlight because actually a lot of our events within the School of Abducted Europe are going to come back to this idea over the coming week or so. And this is the idea of, should we retreat to traditional values? Does the Orthodox moral order provide us salvation from corrupt and corrupt and decaying Europe? Or, as the European answer to that goes, no, you're just burying your head in the sand. So we're going to come back to that at a lot of events in the coming days. And the other thing is that I like the lesson that you can draw from Austroslavism. Now, you may not be able to draw it because it was so short-lived and not very successful, but these Austroslavic thinkers really strongly believed that Slavdom was a central, crucial part of a liberal European order. And what would that mean to continue to think about a liberal European order that is able to coexist with this sort of Slavic confraternity? With regards to Catholic Pan-Slavism, it's very hard to draw much of relevance for today's world. This notion doesn't make much sense anymore, right? Like, there's very few people at this point who still think that the Catholic Church is going to save Slavdom. But it's still, I think, really important to note that this moment in history happened, not to let the connection between the Catholic Church and the Slavic world fall away. But in general, I very much appreciate you listening, and I hope that it's been slightly enlightening to think of Pan-Slavism as differentiated in these ways, and thank you very much. Oh, I think it's turned off.
Questions? Comments?
I'm perfectly happy if not.
Maybe, Kate, you could tell a little bit about more. You kind of pointed to some relevance of this various forms of Pan-Slavism for today, but maybe, I don't know, of course, historians don't like to do this, but maybe you could try to extrapolate these debates of the 19th century to our today's problems with the idea of Europe, the European project, and what does it mean for Eastern European countries, and in particular like Slavic countries, and also maybe European-Russian relations. I don't know, whatever comes to your mind.
It's true, historians don't like to do this, but I will do my best, because I do think that I do think that I see parallels quite often, which is to say, both the European and the Russian sides try to portray each other as the foil of the other, right? So they're playing off of each other. So the Europeans set up this vision, right, as Politsky wrote, we need Austria to protect all of us Slavs from Russia. Meanwhile, Russia's over there, sitting there saying, we need to protect all of you from decaying European society that's rotting away at its core. So there is this contrast, and I think we still get this contrast to a large degree. I think we still do get the message that, oh, the European Union has all of this sort of liberal transparency in how it operates and how it does politics, and it gives all the countries that make up the European Union a say in what happens. Meanwhile, the other message is sort of, we will protect you from all of these horrible things that the European Union is doing to your culture and to your morals and all of that. I mean, this is a sort of reductive way to look at the message that's coming out of Russia, but I do think that there is this strong element of it that is about morality and how our morals need to be saved from Europe. And so, I mean, you can see it as a sort of return of this Austro-Slavic versus Russo-centric versions of Pan-Slavism, the sense that you have this liberal order that is equal rights on one hand, and then this more moral vision of what Slavdom should be on the other.
And maybe the other way around, in some countries, or at least in Ukraine, you can often hear if other Slavic countries, like, I don't know, Poland or Bulgaria, have been successful in joining Europe, this is the best proof that Ukraine can also do this. Or like Russian leaders of the Russian opposition would sometimes say, if Ukraine will succeed with its reforms, then Russia, which is like another Orthodox country, very similar in its political culture and its traditions, can go the same way. So if like one Slavic country manages this means also some hope for others.
Yeah, and this may be where the parallel with the 19th century has a lot more trouble, because in the 19th century there were like really huge differences in levels of development, in levels of acculturation, etc. So if the Czechs can manage it, that doesn't mean that the Galician Ruthenians can manage it, right? Because the differences then, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think the differences then in terms of economic well-being, in terms of level of education, in terms of access to opportunity, I think they were much different then, much starker then than they are now. At the same time, there was always this sense that other Slavic countries are the best model for us to follow. You know, if Serbia does one thing, then maybe we should pay more attention to that than if Greece does something, right? There definitely was that sense, and I think that carries over, sure. And part of it was simply, it's easier to read things in other Slavic languages than it is to read things in other languages, and that continues to be the case, right? So when I'm looking at the documents, at the letters that these people are sending back and forth to each other, one may be writing in Russian while the other is answering in Czech, and then maybe a third person joins the correspondence who's writing in Croatian, and none of them care. And they're like, they are willing to sort of work with each other on that level.
Questions, comments?
Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
Oh, question. No?
Just waving.
Just greeting us. So, should we?
Let's go enjoy our evening.
Yeah. So thank you very much for coming, for joining this very interesting lecture, and see you next time.
On Thursday.
On Thursday, we will welcome Maria Stepanova, who is a Russian journalist, editor-in-chief of the well-known site Koltaru, a writer and a poet. This event will be in Russian, so there will be some pan-Slavism here. Thank you.
Thank you.